himself out of being the direct communicator with that and made an instrumental means of meeting this love. Once we get a handle on that, then we understand the trust that God has placed in you and the trust that God has placed in me, that he believes I have the capacity and the strength given by him to honor the commitment that I have made. The world has lost it. We don't understand it anymore. We've picked our own pockets. We've plundered it. Hollywood entertains us, the last body of people on the face of the earth that seem to understand what love is all about. And yet abundant in their maverick productions, knowing absolutely no boundaries about this. Do you know, during the week of the Super Bowl, with all of the festivities and all that goes on, one night we were watching one of the news programs, and they were interviewing the Iraqi war veterans who were given a unique privilege by these athletes. Some of the wounded who could travel were given a choice of spending one evening in a gathering with one athlete of their choice. And of course, others, entertainment icons and all, got into this, and it was a wonderful gift given to them. Some without arms, some without legs, some heavily wounded, now recovering, were flown into wherever this gathering was and had a wonderful evening. There was this lovely young African-American gal in her uniform, and she was interviewed. She was without her left arm, and here's what she said. She was atop a building where all of a sudden they came under heavy, heavy fire. And while that building was being shelled, she says, before I even knew it, all of a sudden I knew I'd been hit, and my comrades rescued me. I knew my left arm had gone flying, and I was without my left arm from the shoulder. And as they put me onto a stretcher and rushed me down, as they put me into an ambulance, she said, I was screaming, and one of them said, are you in pain? Are you in pain? She said, no, my ring, my wedding ring. I've lost my hand. Against orders, 2 or 3 of the guys jumped out of that vehicle, went back to the roof, found the hand, rescued the ring, and brought it back to her. And she stood there in front of the camera, flashing that wedding ring now in her right hand. And I want to ask you this question. How proud would you have been if you were the husband of that woman, knowing that her greatest agony during that lost moment was not the arm, but the ring? That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the reality of a moral commitment that God invests in you and invests in me. Think of love, the nobility of it, the sacrifice of it, the circumference of it, and yet it has boundaries. It has boundaries. And so my third thing is this. You cannot say the answer is love unless you ask the question of life's intrinsic value. Hear me? You cannot say the answer is love unless you ask the question of life's intrinsic value. So question number 1, you cannot talk of evil without assuming a moral framework and locating it ultimately in the heart of man. Number 2, you cannot cry for justice unless you know the justifiable source for all moral law. Number 3, you cannot say the answer is love unless you ask the question of life's intrinsic value. Wasn't this what the whole issue of Terry Schiavo was all about? Is this a value of intrinsic worth or extrinsic worth? Are we conferring value, or is there intrinsic, essential value to a human being? And as I see it, the mystery and reality of evil, the cry of justice, the hunger for love, and the fourth and the most important thing here is the inescapable dependence on forgiveness. The inescapable dependence on forgiveness. Which of us has not ever needed that? In that one instance where I was accused of pushing away a stool, it's nice to know that you're the innocent one somehow being blamed. Think of the number of times where I ought to have been blamed and really wasn't. We just get away with it. We get away with it. Sometimes in the West, we do not understand this. I well remember in my early days as a believer, meeting a young Muslim man in Delhi who had come to know Christ in the recent days that I just come across him. And I remember him saying he cries and sobs uncontrollably because he thinks of the many ways in which he had grieved God, in which he had offended God, in which he had violated his law. He talked about the heaviness of heart and the repentance, that there was only his hope that God would forgive him because he desperately needed to be forgiven. Some of you have heard me tell this story, but I remember some years ago, I think it was in Anaheim, California, when I was at a book signing along with several other authors, and your publishers keep you in their confines and in their stalls, and you're standing there as people come and want their book signed, and my wife was standing next to me, and all of a sudden I looked at the publishing house next door to mine, and I saw a man standing there all alone. And I called Margie over. I said, I think that's Jim Bakker of PTL fame. I remember the days when he used to come to occasions like that, and he and his wife would be sitting on what could only be described as golden thrones. And people would come and just almost pay homage to them, grabbing the hand and kissing the hand and so on. And they sat there. Now, he was a fallen man. He was a disenfranchised man. He was a man with a black mark upon his career. He was literally standing there all alone in front of the bookstall. And that night he spoke, and the crowd listened in riveted attention. His book, of course, is entitled, I Was Wrong. And he said how he remembered the day when he was in prison with his overalls sloshing water all over the place in the bathrooms, cleaning the bathrooms with mop and bucket and all that. When a guard came to him and said, Jim, he said, there's somebody here to see you. You might want to come and say hello. He said, I don't want to meet anybody. He said, no, I think you'd want to meet this man. And he said, looking at himself with all of these watermarks splashed over his overalls, he thought he'd go and change. And then he said, no, I'd better go like this. And wiping away his hands, wondering who had really come to visit him, Jim Bakker tells the story of how he walked into the visitor's lounge. And as he walked there, he was momentarily caught completely off guard, couldn't say a word, as he saw Billy and Ruth Graham standing there in the visiting lounge. And Billy just strode right over to Jim Bakker and wrapped his arms around him, overalls, dirt and all, and just held him in his arms. And Bakker then said, I cried and cried in the arms of a man, realizing I represented all that was untrustworthy in this land. He represented all that could be trusted, and I was wrapped in his arms. The joy of forgiveness. My wife was reminding me of the story of the Scarlet and the Black, a true story of a Catholic priest from the Vatican who was involved in smuggling out Jews to rescue them from the hate of the Nazis. And that movie is the role is played by the famed Gregory Peck. He does a great job in that as he is in this underground escape route for these Jews. And the Gestapo is on to him, and they tell him if he makes one step outside the Vatican, inside the Vatican, he had diplomatic immunity. One step outside the Vatican, and they would get him. So he would come almost to the boundary line and taunt them. But one way or the other, through disguises, he would get out of there, and this underground escape route was held intact. In the last days and hours, as the Nazi regime was coming to an end, one Gestapo officer managed to get to see him, and he said, I have a plea for you. Do me a favor. I know my life is going to come to an end. I'm going to get caught. But I want you to help rescue my wife and my children. And the man looks at him and says, you have audacity? With all that you've killed, with all that you've destroyed, you now want your wife and your children to be rescued in all of this? And he really gives him a verbal tongue lashing. The Gestapo officer looks at him and says, so much for your Christianity then, is it? So much for your grace and all that, and walks away. After the story comes to an end, the Allies are looking across the table at this Gestapo officer and one says to him, how did you get your wife and children out of here? Where are they? He said, I didn't get them out. He said, oh yeah, they've been rescued. How did you do it? And then it dawns on him that the priest had made arrangements to rescue the wife and the children and get them out of there. And in the postscript to the movie it says, while this man was in prison, the priest visited him every day. Till the day of his release, he asked if he could be baptized and know this Christ that the priest was living for. Isn't that what the grace is all about and forgiveness is all about? Ladies and gentlemen, here it is. You cannot talk of reconciliation unless you also ask the question of the atonement and of our alienation. You cannot talk of reconciliation unless you also talk of alienation and the atonement. Number one, you cannot cry evil without a moral framework and the heart of man. Number two, you cannot cry for justice without a justifiable source of moral law. Number three, you cannot answer with love unless you grant the question of intrinsic worth. And number four, you cannot talk of reconciliation unless you ask the question of the atonement and of alienation. And so the naturalist and the humanist talks of evil, talks of justice, talks of love, and talks of forgiveness. With these four answers of evil, justice, love, and forgiveness, only in the understanding of the question, why did Jesus Christ have to die, can we legitimize these other answers. For you see, ladies and gentlemen, there's only one event in the world in which these four converge. It is only on Calvary that you have evil, justice, love, and forgiveness in one act converging, which means the skeptic, in the hunger for these four, is implicitly pointing to Calvary. There is no other way to justify these four categories. And as I pondered it and I thought, what question would I ask to counter this point? Frankly, I couldn't come up with any. How do you talk about evil without talking about the human heart? How do you talk about justice without talking about an ultimate moral law? How do you talk about love without talking about intrinsic worth? How do you talk about forgiveness without having somebody who pays? You know what? You won't hear too many sermons on forgiveness from an Islamic pulpit. I mean that. You won't hear sermons on forgiveness in Buddha's preaching. You don't hear it in the pantheistic worldview. In karma, you pay, you pay, you pay. In Islam, it's inshallah. The wish of Allah, the wish of God. Only on the cross of Calvary do you have a concrete expression of these four truths. You know, when Mel Gibson said he spent 14 years studying the Passion till he was ready to release it in a movie, he knew what he was pondering about. That grand mystery of a bloodied body, of a battering unthinkable, of a humiliation that till today, if you are talked about, debate an Islamic scholar, he spews back at me. How can you have a God who is at the mercy of his people? How can you have a Christ as the Son of God, bullied, tortured? Where is his strength? Where is his power? And they question and question and question, not seeing the depths of mercy and the depths of love and the depths of power. The famed E. Stanley Jones, who preached for many decades in India, who I had the privilege of hearing in his latter years, used to talk for about 1.5 hours in all of his lectures without a scrap of paper in front of him. His famous books, The Christ of the Round Table, The Christ of the Indian Road. Mahatma Gandhi had a huge impact on E. Stanley Jones had a huge impact on Mahatma Gandhi. And E. Stanley Jones was telling the story of a time an Indian aristocrat came to him and said he understood a lot about the gospel, but he did not understand the death on the cross. Why the cross? Why the cross? Why did Jesus have to die? Until this man had floundered and fallen and stumbled into an adulterous relationship, and his wife was on to him and found out what had happened. It crushed her beyond measure, as it was at least outwardly crushing him. He asked her for forgiveness and said it wouldn't happen again. And even as she wept and wiped away the tears, she accepted his explanation and decided she would just bury this sorrow and let it go. And he told Stanley Jones later, he said, you know, I wondered, how could she have just gotten over it? How could she have just said, we'll bury it, we'll forget it? He said, until one day I came home early from work, and I walked into the room, and my wife, who is a believer, he said, in Christ, was on her knees crying and crying and crying, Jesus, help me, help me, help me to bury this, help me to cover this, will you take this burden of me? And the husband says, as I stood at the door and watched my wife so broken, pleading for the blood of the cross to help her bury it, he said, for the first time I understood what it means when love is crucified by sin. As sin was thrown onto love, and as Jesus answered back, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Do you now understand why Mark has 33% of his entire gospel devoted to the last week of Christ? 1/3 of his entire gospel, the first gospel, is given over to the passion of the Lord. It was something he wanted to explain for people to understand. That's why even Peter the apostle, when Jesus looked at him and asked him 2 questions, he answered them. Question number 1, who do men say that I am? Some say Jeremiah, some say Elijah, some say one of the prophets. Who do you say that I am? You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus says, blessed are you, Simon, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And the Bible says from that moment on, he began to teach them what manner of death he will die. And the scriptures say this, Peter then took Jesus aside and rebuked him, saying, never, Lord, never. This fisherman looked at the Lord and rebuked him. He said, you're not going to die this kind of death, are you? And he said, get thee behind me, Satan. You're not minding the things of God, but you're minding the things of men. Ladies and gentlemen, when justice, love, mercy, and forgiveness are talked about, but the cross is evicted in that discussion, we are minding more the ways of the devil of solving it. It is only when the cross is centerpiece can these 4 be explained. And we need to understand why it is that Jesus Christ went to the cross for you, sir, and why he went to the cross for me. It is these truths that you pursue that were embodied on Calvary so that you and I could walk away forgiven with the love of God and understanding the evil heart that lives within us and how a just God paid the price for our forgiveness. Let me bring this to a close. In his Everlasting Man, G.K. Chesterton says this. Listen, please. Life is a great game of noughts and crosses. The noughts, the circle represents the basic monotony of life. The most eloquent symbol on a pagan temple, says Chesterton, was a serpent with the tail in its mouth, a complete circle. But for the Christian, says Chesterton, you must put the cross inside the knot. The 4 extremes of the cross will pierce the knot. That's 0. When you put the cross inside of it, the 4 extremities pierce and take away the circularity and the redundancy of life and brings in the breath of God and moves you in a direction that he intended for you and to me. May I say that those 4 extremities could well be the nature of evil, the nature of justice, the nature of love, and the nature of forgiveness. When that cross gets into the center of your life and pierces those extremities, then you understand what life is all about. Martin Luther said this, and with this I close. He wrote a letter to a friend. He says, I was lately looking out of my window last night, and I saw the stars in the heavens and God's great beautiful arch over my head. But I could not see any pillars on which the great builder had fixed this arch. And yet the heavens fell not, and the great arch stood firmly. There are some who are always feeling for pillars and longing to touch them, and because they cannot touch them, they stand trembling and fearing lest the heavens should fall. If they could only grasp the pillars, then the heavens would stand fast. May I suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, there is no place to anchor evil, justice, love, and forgiveness. There is only one structure that holds them together with meaning. That is the cross of Jesus Christ. So my talk to you tonight was called Questionable Answers. How the answers of the skeptic still point to the person of Jesus Christ. When your questions and your answers connect, then life bridges the mind with the heart and frees you to truly live for the purpose that God has created you. If you do not know Jesus Christ tonight, here's my invitation to you. Get back home this evening and get on your knees and do this prayer in a simple way and an honest way. Lord Jesus, if you are who you claim to be, I'm open. Reveal yourself to me. If you've got a Bible, start reading the Gospel of John, and you'll begin to see why he is the way, the truth, and the life. If you already are a follower of Christ, I want to encourage you to probe the depths of this grand master of ours and understand how rich are his truths, how delectable are his mercies, how enthralling is his gospel. There is nothing like it on the face of the earth. The reason I was in Indonesia was for one man, very highly powerful businessman, a Muslim man. Last time I was there, he was talking to me while I was in the car on the way to the airport. And he was challenging the Christian faith with one question after another. I said to him, I'll make you a promise. You give me one morning and ask me any question on the Christian faith. I'll give you one morning and ask you any question on Islam. And I'll promise within a year I'll be back. So he arrives and he spends the whole morning with me. By 12 o'clock at noon, he said, I have to say, I do not have answers to most of these questions. I said, are you willing to pray and ask Jesus to reveal himself to you? He said, yes. So there we were in my hotel room, praying with this man. And as he walked away, I just am waiting for the chance to see him again and find out. I can say that quite boldly because he's really not qualified to address some of the issues he claims to address. So many times we in our churches have sounded forth things like that. We've gone and spoken and done our bit, sung our songs and done our preaching. At the end of it, the people say, I don't have a clue what that was all about. And if you open up the sachet of naturalism, it's hollow at the beginning as well. But if spirituality is used as a seductive force, it could be the most destructive thing you have ever entered into, because it actually gives you the feeling of being in contact with God when all you have ended up doing is deifying yourself.
And now here's Ravi Zacharias with the second part of his message, East and West.
If you add to this the Buddhist link, add to this the Taoist link, add to this the Hindu and the Greek link and so on, what you really end up with is no absolute truth, morality is relative, there's no purpose and meaning, language will ever shift and be redefined by the definer who wants to do the defining. So you end up with a postmodern mindset of no truth, no meaning, no certainty. What do we do as Christians? How does Christ come into all of this? In a Libyan desert, there was a certain stone found, and this is what it said. I, the captain of the Legion of Rome, serving in the desert of Libya, have learned and pondered this truth in life. Listen very carefully. I, the captain of the Legion of Rome, serving in the desert of Libya, have learned and pondered this truth in life. There are two things to be sought, love and power. No one has both. When Gaddafi was finally cornered, And in that pathetic sign, as his body was denuded, what we are told is that he was begging for mercy, that they would not kill him. Love and power, no one has both. He had the power with no love. Now he was pleading for love when somebody else had the power, and it did not work for him. That's pretty close to the truth, but it's dead wrong. There is one person in the world who has both love and power, and that is Jesus Christ. So I turn over a leaf now, and I want to give you 3 solutions to this that will need to be attended, and then take you to the gospel. Where is God in all of this? Where is Jesus Christ in all of this? How did we lose him in America? How did we lose him in America? I was sitting next to a preacher that I will not name, one of the biggest churches in this country. He happened to be sitting next to each other because we're going to preach the same conference. We're boarded the plane. I won't name the city. Boarded the plane in one city, we're going to another city. And he looked at me and he said, "Aren't you Ravi?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Nice to meet you." And he gave me his name. I said, "I'm sorry, I didn't recognize you." So we chatted. I said, "How are things going?" He said, "It's going well, going well." And we started talking. He said, basically, the people from my father's generation and all were fighting things that didn't really matter. What does it matter about the inerrancy of scriptures? Who cares? Who cares? What does it matter? The guy sitting next to me and ranting this stuff off, preaching to thousands every Sunday, and I said, "You don't think it matters that the source that you're using with which to guide lines is a God-given source and God-breathed, and therefore in its substance it's infallible and without error?" And I told him an illustration after that and a story. He was quite stunned by it. I won't go into the details of that. But you know what actually has happened in America and in most of Europe? The same thing that had happened in Josiah's time. What happened in Josiah's time? The book of the law was lost. The book of the law was lost. Josiah became king at age 8. At about 8, 12 or 15, he started to seek after God. In his early 20s, he began to cleanse the city, and late 20s, he began to cleanse the temple. And all of a sudden, they found the dusty volume of the law of God, and the secretary comes to him and he says, "You'll never believe what I found." You have to ask, how long was this missing? The Word of God, the law of God, which is based on the absolute character of God, not on the relativistic whims of humanity, was lost. And where it was lost was in the house of God. When the law of the Lord is lost in the house of God, there is no message left to give to the spiritually minded. We haven't got an authority left anymore after that. And you look again and again and again, and you ask yourself the question, how did this happen that our places of worship so often can be filled with thousands of young people who really don't know the Word of God? Now, we have to make it attractive, we have to make it beautiful, we have to make it relevant. Yes, I understand all of that. But if the Word of God is not there from the pulpit and the Word of God is not central to the teaching, what on earth are we doing with the masses of people Sunday after Sunday? And so even Bill Hybels, years after the experiment, comes out and says, "I made a mistake, big time mistake." He said, "I brought in this consulting agency to study the products of our church," and he said, "when we found out, I really actually didn't even want to print it." So shocked. Because I found out we'd really not made any disciples. I'll tell you, if this country is going to change, it'll have to begin with the church. We talk of all the symptoms of cultural war, and we've not dealt with the cause, that we ourselves have lost the capacity to engage the mind of the young with the power and the potency of the very law of God. So we lost him in the temple. Secondly, where did we lose him? In Luke chapter 2, you've got Mary and Joseph in the midst of the Passover. Good, godly people. They had to be to make all this trek. And the whole ceremony is over. And they're driving, they're riding back home in this long caravan. And it was a long while after one of them said, "Where's Jesus? I thought you had him." "I don't. Didn't you have him?" "No." "Do you think one of our friends has him?" They walked through the whole caravan. Nobody has Jesus. They'd gone for the Passover. False assumptions that you actually believe it'll be somebody else's responsibility to make sure Jesus is in the center of your home, your life, your family. Can you imagine how the parents felt? You know what is astounding about Jesus' response? His mother and father come to him. And what does he say to them? "Did you not know I needed to be in my Father's house?" The place of worship had become a hangout for crooks. And so he's debating with the doctors of the law. "Didn't you not know I need to be in my Father's house?" And then as an adult he read, "You've said you've made my house a den of crooks, a den of thieves." Ladies and gentlemen, I'll be honest with you. I wish sometimes I could now say, I've done my part. I wish so, because it'd be easier. I could write, I could enjoy not doing many things that travel entails. But I believe God has called me to have a responsibility, and God's called you to have a responsibility. Please don't assume that it's somebody else's. Don't assume this is somebody else's responsibility. And if there's one thing I'd like you to do, and this has got nothing to do with RZIM, it's got everything to do with your relationship with God, ask him, what is the load he wants you to lighten and where? What is the load he wants you to carry for him and where? I think of how easy it is to be at the Passover and lose Jesus, to be in the temple of God and lose the law. And then the third scene is John 18, the most defining moment of political power gone wrong, when he looks at Jesus eyeball to eyeball, and he asks him if he's the king, and when he received the answer, he didn't like it. And he looks at Jesus and says, when Jesus says that they that are on the side of truth listen to him, Pilate made the ultimate blunder of looking eyeball to eyeball into the eyes of truth, saying, what is truth? And walked away. And walked away. At least if he'd paused for a moment to allow to see what Jesus would say, he didn't. What is truth? It's almost like he's teaching Jesus, you've got nothing to say to me, and he's gone. Political power gone wrong, ecclesiastical power gone wrong, ceremony gone wrong. So what do people do? They go into a spirituality mode with all these esoteric sounding words. One of the authors I quoted, her own life got terribly messed up. I read some of her thoughts. Her own life got terribly messed up. That spirituality thing didn't do a thing for her. You see what happened after Maharishi Mahesh Yogi died, and the lawsuits that ensued, people grabbing after this, after that. Same thing happened after Yogananda died. The same thing has just happened after Sai Baba has died in Bangalore. This billion-dollar empire of this man with that huge hairdo, millions of followers all over the world, and now they are finding out under the carpet all that was messed up personally, privately, and the money is being squabbled over, bank accounts are being frozen, and everybody's laying claim to the money. That's all this has become about. It's not spirituality. It's the mass marketing of spirituality. You know, when you read the life of Oprah Winfrey and see the power in her early days, she'd always write a word about Jesus and a verse from there. And I've given a whole chapter to her own involvement in what happened as she shaped the medium and the medium shaped her. She shaped the medium, then the medium shaped her. She wanted to become a goddess. She assumed she was a goddess, and millions today with her pronouncement take her at her word. And you say to yourself, is this where we're at? Is this where we're at? I want to take you to 3 conclusions about the gospel. The number 1 conclusion is this, that there is something so unique about the gospel of Jesus Christ that is not found anywhere else. In December of, please give me your undivided attention, I'm bringing this down to a funnel now. In December of 2008, a rank atheist and a man who chose to live a rather personally sensuous lifestyle, his name is Matthew Paris. He went to Africa because when he was a young boy, his parents were there. And he went and saw a tiny missionary movement called the Pump Fund or something like that, Pump Project. And he took a look at some missionaries there. They so overwhelmed him with their lives. He said, I couldn't believe such deeply dedicated people. And he wrote an article that month. Listen to what this atheist actually has to say. I went to see this work. It inspired me, renewing my flagging faith in development charities. But traveling in Malawi refreshed another belief too, one I've been trying to banish all my life. It confounds my ideological beliefs and stubbornly refuses to fit my own worldview. It has embarrassed my growing belief that there is no God. Now, as a confirmed atheist, I'm convinced of the enormous contribution that Christian evangelism makes in Africa, sharply distinct from any secular NGOs. Education and training alone will not do. In Africa, Christianity is changing people's hearts. That's what it's going to take. It brings a transformation, and this rebirth is real. There's long been a fashion among Western academic sociologists for placing tribal value systems within a ring fence beyond critiques founded in theirs and therefore best for them, authentic and of intrinsically equal worth to ours. I don't follow this. I observe that tribal belief is no more peaceable than ours and that it suppresses individuality. People think collectively. This feeds into the big man and gangster politics of the African city, the exaggerated respect for the swaggering leader and the literal inability to understand the whole idea of a loyal opposition. Anxiety, fear of spirits, of ancestors, of natures and ancestors and of nature and wild strikes deep into the whole structure of rural African thought. A great weight grinds down the spirit of the people. But Christianity, with its teaching of a direct, personal, two-way link between the individual and God, unmediated by the collective and unsubordinate to any other human being, smashes straight through the philosophical, spiritual framework I've just described. Those who want Africa to walk tall amid the 21st century global competition must not kid themselves that providing the material means or even the know-how that accompanies what we call development will make that change. No. A whole belief system has to be changed. And I'm afraid it has to be supplanted by another. Removing Christian evangelism from the African equation may leave the continent at the mercy of a malign fusion of Nike, the witch doctor, the mobile phone, and the machete. Wow. From an atheist, Christian conversion. Do you believe that? Do you believe that? That's what Meher was talking about earlier today. The whole way of thinking has to be changed. I love it when I hear my colleagues speak because there's such beauty in what they say. I won't even name some of them, but I hear them saying it again and again and again. And this transformation that Christ brings, I hear them in their tapes and read it in their books. And I was in Washington and sitting down when we were all there listening to Michael speak at Georgetown. And he presented the gospel that night very clearly. Spoke from the book of Jude. The changed heart, the transformed heart. That's what it is. Spirituality will not do that for you. There's a second thing, and that is this. Christ's presence outside of yourself will bring you the mystical, but it is not enough in and of itself. And then I'll close with my last thought. Many of you know that one of my good friends passed away this year, Nick Charles. Nick was exactly my age. 17 years ago, I met Nick Charles. I was speaking in Atlanta. I don't know who he was. I've not watched much of the night sports programs, but he was quite a big icon. Handsome-looking guy, big mop of hair, a Greek ancestry, handsome features. He was quite the playboy in his own words. He said, Ravi, just run the mill. A little bit like Sanj said yesterday. Nick said, I've done it all. He said, I'm a mess. Help me. So we got talking, he's one of the few people I actually devoted specific amount of time to, quite a bit. He became quite close to our family. And some years ago when he wanted to get married, I was officiated at his wedding to Corey Azambrado, who's a lovely gal. She's a producer with CNN. A few years ago, they were having difficulty deciding whether to have a child, and they came and talked to me, and we had a conversation, and wonderfully they decided to have a baby. And a beautiful, beautiful little girl, Giovanna, was born. She's about 5. About a little over 2 years ago, Nick phoned me in Atlanta. He said, can I have lunch? I said, sure, Nick. I went out and had lunch. He was sitting right at the table in front. I didn't recognize him. He said, Ravi. I looked at him. I was shocked. His hair was gone, his skeletal-looking face, and I sat down. He said, man, I'm dying of cancer. Dying of cancer. I've been given 20 months to live. I've told them to use their biggest guns and help me get rid of this. I cried sitting in front of Nick. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. He wanted to live in Santa Fe, and he decided to build a home there, beautiful home. He said, I know I'm dying, but I want my wife and daughter to have a place, and I'm going to do it. So they moved to Santa Fe, and he was in touch with me. I was about to begin a 7-week tour, and he said, will you come and visit me one last time, because I don't think I'll be around when you finish this trip. So Margie and I flew to Santa Fe. When I walked into the room, it was like his body was on a vibrator. It was like this, but it was just completely out of whack. There was a nurse sitting there trying to grab his arm, and the male nurse was trying to get something into him. He called me over, and he wanted to grab my hand, and he just grabbed my hand, and he was just going like this. I prayed with him. He looked pathetic. Gradually, he calmed down. He said, I'm so sorry. I'm really so sorry. He said, sit down here. And he said, please pray for me again. So I stood up so that I could hold his hand comfortably. And as I was standing up to hold his hand, and the nurse sitting on the other side of the bed, his wife, Corey, with her arm around Margie there, his little daughter trying to keep herself busy. His dog came over, a Labradoodle, big guy, nuzzled against my legs there quietly and with his chin on his bed. And I held his hand and prayed for him. And after it was all over, he said, please, let's go out for dinner. I said, Nick, you can't do it. He said, I want to do it. Let's do it. Somehow got his clothes on, and we went out, and we were sitting, 4 of us, for dinner in a country club that he belonged to. And he has a CNN sportscaster, big success story now, dying. He'd come to know Christ, and his life had been so radically transformed. He looked at me and said, can I tell you something? He said, a few weeks ago, I was lying in bed, my little girl next to me and my wife, and he said, I was in such pain. I said, all right, Jesus, enough. It's enough. Enough. Can I come home tonight, please? Take me home. He said, my wife and daughter are sound asleep, and I propped my head up in the pillow, and I was crying, please take me home tonight. He said, Ravi, a light shone in the corner of the room. And a person I've always pictured the way Jesus would probably be walked over towards me and held my hand the way you did it today. And he said, Nick, I'll take you home, but not tonight. At the right time, I'll take you home. He said, my brother, I have not fretted since that day. When the right time comes, he will take me home. I was traveling overseas, and a CNN producer phoned me. He said, I'm writing a story on Nick. Thousands of his fans were writing in tens of thousands. He said, Ravi, did he tell you this story about this vision and all? I said, yeah. He said, what do you think of it? I said, what do you think of it, Craig? He said, I'm an atheist. I said, let me tell you what I think of it. The important thing to me is, Craig, that God's revelation is based to us in history, in His Word, and confirmed in personal experience. The vision to me at that moment is secondary, but it's precisely what Nick needed. Nick needed it at that moment, and God met him where he needed him most. That's not what Nick's faith was based on something larger than that. I said, what do you think of Nick? He said, he's for real. I said, then take the story that way too. Take the story that way. You know what we've often missed with the spiritual hunger of people? We've made this Christian faith so far away in doctrinaire stuff. We've spent very little time talking about how deeply spiritually minded Jesus was too, in the spiritual reality of worship, music, the mystical and the prayer, and we've made him some kind of a theoretical figure. But the last thing I want to say to you is, one day it will all come together. It will all come together when body, mind, soul, and everything are in sync. And I close with this now. You know, some of the songs that Fernando sings, like Come Thou Love Divine, and the other one you sang from the Anglican hymnal. I don't want to get sidetracked, but I just wonder why we don't write like that anymore. Some of the stuff we hear these days, it takes longer to sing than to write. There's no depth, nothing in there. But the deep. I love the great hymns. I love the great songs, the classics. And in my car when I'm driving, I listen to one of them. One of my all-time favorites is by the Scottish tenor Kenneth MacKellar, who says this: seated one day at the organ, I was weary and ill at ease, and my fingers wandered idly over the noisy keys. I know not what I was playing or what I was dreaming then, but I touched one chord of music like the sound of a great Amen. It flooded the crimson twilight like the close of an angel's psalm. It lay o'er my feeble spirit like the touch of infinite calm. It quieted pain and sorrow like love overcoming strife. It seemed a harmonious echo from our discordant life. It linked all perplexed meanings into one perfect peace and trembled away into silence as though it were loath to cease. I've sought and I seek it vainly, that one lost chord divine which came from the soul of the organ and entered into mine. It may be that death's bright angel will speak in that chord again, and it may be that only in heaven I shall hear the grand Amen. I remember when I finished praying with Nick, I opened my eyes and I was looking across a mountain range called the Blood of Christ. The dog by my side, his wife, his daughter. Society is constantly wrestling with, particularly the skeptic, constantly wrestling with, and how in their answers I see that those answers are in many ways hinting in the direction that a Christian himself would have to give, except they are giving it from a secular worldview. And what I want to do is look at 4 answers that they give. Listen to me very carefully now. 4 answers that they give, to which only the question that justifies them is the one that also legitimizes why Jesus Christ is the only way. 4 answers they give, to which the only question that legitimizes these answers is also the question that has implicit in it why Jesus Christ is the only way to God. And when you examine these, you'll begin to see what I'm really driving at. You almost have to wait till the last 5 to 10 minutes of the presentation to see how this thing actually comes together. The first is the reality and the mystery of evil. The reality and the mystery of evil. Just a month or so ago, in the New York Times of all places, there was a lead article and it said this: for the worst of us, the diagnosis may be evil. Here's what the writer says: Predatory killers often do far more than commit murder. Some have lured their victims into homemade chambers for prolonged torture. Others have exotic tastes for vivisection, sexual humiliation, burning. Many perform their grisly rituals as much for pleasure for themselves as for any other reason. Among themselves, a few forensic scientists have taken to thinking of these people as not merely disturbed, but actually evil. Evil in that deliberate, habitual savagery, and defies any psychological attempt at explanation or attempt at treatment. Most psychiatrists assiduously avoid this word evil, contending that its use would precipitate a dangerous slide from clinical to moral judgment that could put people on death row unnecessarily and obscure the understanding of violent criminals. But many career forensic examiners now say that their work forces them to reflect on the concept of evil, and some actually acknowledge that they can find no other term for certain individuals they have evaluated. In an effort to standardize what makes a crime particularly heinous, a group at New York University has now been developing what it calls a depravity scale, which rates the horror of an act by the sum of its grim details. And a prominent personality expert at Columbia University has published a 22-level hierarchy of evil behavior derived from detailed biographies of more than 500 violent victims. We are talking about people who commit breathtaking acts, who do so repeatedly, who know what they are doing, and who are doing it in peacetime under no threat to themselves, said Dr. Michael Stone, the Columbia psychiatrist, who's examined several hundred killers at Mid-Hudson Psychiatric Center in New Hampton, New York, and others at Creedmoor Psychiatric Center in Queens, where he consults and teaches. We know from experience who these people are and how they behave, and it is about time, he said, that we give their behavior the proper appellation. And it goes on, debating with other scholars. When Ronald Reagan, during his presidency, referred to the Soviet Union as that evil empire, and then looked into the eye of the camera and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, pull that wall down. Pull that wall down." He was intimating at an ideology that had extracted the lives of millions of people, both in its home territory and outside. Just a few weeks ago, as I said, my colleagues and I were in Berlin. And as we were walking in where that checkpoint Charlie once stood, separating east from west, where the wall no longer stands, you can see memorabilia, you can buy books, but unfortunately, people tend to forget that that wall was just in the recent past history. Prior to that, when you examine all that had gone on in Germany and all that the Berliners had been subjected to, you begin to actually see how that hell may well have been in session, and evil was the only description you could give to what had gone on. I was reading the journals of several men and women trapped during the rulership of the Third Reich. I was reading one just this morning from a 17-year-old German soldier, a man who was, his name is Helmut Altner, who was a conscript in the army and happened to be there in the last stand in April almost 60 years ago to this very day. And he was going through the streets with his comrades, knowing that minutes were lying ahead and it would all be over. Listen to a 17-year-old writing. "We're on the great road to Berlin. The inhabitants stand outside their doors. They shrink back as our steps echo loudly off the walls of the houses. Then they breathe again with satisfaction because we are Germans. Time is pushing on, inexorably towards the final hour. Women are pressing in from the south. Men hurry across the road, glancing around timidly. SS patrols drive their cars through the streets, stopping a man here, picking up a man there. The car drives off, motors singing. Members of the People Reserve, mainly in SS uniform, close the anti-tank obstacles. Hitler Youth walk the streets proudly with anti-tank grenade launchers. On our right is a large square ringed by the facades of bombed-out houses. 2 SA men in uniform stand by a lamppost. A civilian is hanging bound to a post. There is a red electric cable around his neck. which has bitten deeply into his flesh. His face is blue. His eyes are sunken in the sockets. Around his neck hangs a white cardboard sign saying, I am Otto Mayer. I was too cowardly to fight for my wife and my child. That is why I am hanging here. I am a rat. I feel a choking sensation inside me as I see this. I would like to look away, and yet I cannot take my eyes off this terrible spectacle. The SA men are laughing and smoking. The dead man swings quietly in the wind. A civilian walking alongside explains in a low voice why this soldier was hanged. He came back just like us, exhausted and war-weary. He escaped the raging battle of extermination and encirclement before the gates of Berlin. He was so young. His wife begged him to stay, and he gave in. Neighbors betrayed him. The SS picked him up. Before the eyes of his horrified wife, before the eyes of his child, he was brutally murdered. First, though, he had to write the shameful sign with his own hands. The SS dictated the text, grinning. Then they strung him up, the wires cut into his neck, and soon killed him. His wife lay unconscious on the ground. The SS drove away. The SA men took over. Journal after journal after journal. This kind of brutality, this kind of mass killing. What do we call this? How do we escape the obvious when we see such horrific acts that remind us human beings have committed slaughter for all kinds of reasons? You know, interestingly, from Germany, I went on to India, as I said, and then into Thailand. While I was in Thailand, actually, on that morning, I just left Indonesia, and that morning, another massive earthquake struck. You may have remembered reading it. And they were afraid of another tsunami warning that was given with the tides that they thought would swell up once again, and tens of thousands could be lost. I was in Bangkok. Phuket is where the resort was that was hit the last time. So all of the hotel managers had to evacuate their guests and left a lot of money. Lost a lot of money. In the Bangkok Post the next day, when the tsunami didn't arrive, was this interview with men and women who were strippers in these resorts. I won't take the time to read it to you, but basically what it says is this, that these strippers have a particular name given to them. And these men and women were utterly infuriated at the management for a false alarm, because most of them now lost their livelihood. All of those who complained for one reason. I want you to hear me now. This is a fact in the land happening to large numbers of young men. They have found out that the way they can make their money is by a sex change operation that costs $10,000. There are thousands of them performing in these resorts to earn money so that they can effectively actually have the sex change operation done and earn money as a woman dancer somewhere. The words go something like this. It's a dream to become a woman, but my income dropped after the tsunami because the tourists fell away. I don't know what else to do, and I love this job. Suki, who is saving for a sex change operation, does not know if it'll be good for his career, but it's his dream to become a woman. Dam, a 30-year-old man who has undergone a sex change, said his income from tips was so meager that his colleagues would probably have to wait a long time before they raised money for the operation themselves. On Monday night, I didn't run like the others, said one. I was sound asleep. If the tsunami had struck, I would be in a real bad shape. So these men, bemoaning a false alarm because it kept them from 1 or 2 days of tips in order to transform the body to look like that of a woman and market themselves in the arena of the sex trade. What do you say to things like this? How do you react? So whether it's violence or sensuality, and then you come over to the United States. It was that very week in Bangkok, all over the news was plastered the tragic shooting that took place in Minnesota at the hands of a young man. And you look around our society and you see things like this happening. What I want to say is this, ladies and gentlemen, whether it's violence or sensuality or brutality or whatever it is, we have to take a step back and ask ourselves the question, who are we? And what is the locus of evil? Who are we as a people? in this brilliant book that Os Guinness has just written called Unspeakable. He gives us a very fascinating account. He gives us a fascinating account of what was happening a decade ago in Rwanda, where hundreds of thousands, I think 800,000 or 1 million men and women lost their lives in the slaughter at that time. One world leader, whom I shall leave unnamed, arrived there, landed, left his plane engines running, and spent 2 hours at the airport talking to the NATO forces and talked to the NATO general, who happened to be Canadian. And just before he took off, he looked at the NATO general and said to him, "I'm really sorry. I didn't know it was this bad." And the NATO general responded after this world leader left, and he says this. He says, "Didn't know? He didn't know?" He says, "I've spent my life in NATO, and I know what NATO planes overhead knew. Now I am haunted by dreams by the eyes of thousands and thousands of Africans, disembodied, dismembered, staring out at the African darkness." Listen to what he says now. You cannot just walk away from something like that saying, you didn't know and you didn't know what you could. You can't just Pontius Pilate 800,000 people. The first point I want to make to you is this. No, it's not Rudolf Hess. No, it's not the Nazis. No, it's not the Russian soldiers who came there in the slaughter. It's reflective of all of us. We're all in this together. And as the Allied forces knew what was happening in the slaughter of millions and millions of people, and world leaders were really in some ways handcuffed, or in other ways not even dealing with it, the whole world was implicated. And so the first thing we need to bear in mind is, it is not that the evil is there done by somebody else. All of humanity shares this. We cannot Pontius Pilate a mass of humanity and say others are doing it. But the second point I want to make is this, and this is very critical in the body of what I'm trying to say to you. When we are talking about evil, Guinness lists a whole host of humanistic writers who basically make this pronouncement in one way or the other. Listen, for example, Virgil in his Aeneid. What region of the earth is not full of our calamities? Thomas Hobbes in De Homine. Man is the most cunning, the strongest, and the most dangerous animal. Voltaire, after the 1755 Lisbon earthquake, where tens of thousands died, writes to a pastor, "I pity the Portuguese like you, but men still do more harm to each other on their little molehill than nature does to them. Our wars massacre more men than are swallowed up by our earthquakes." The skeptic David Hume in his dialogues concerning natural religion, "Man is the greatest enemy of man." Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the humanist in Émile, "Seek the author of evil no longer, it is yourself." And here's what I want to say to you. If these are humanists talking, and the answer then is that humanity itself is wrong, what is the question? The question is, where is evil located? It's located in your heart and mine. Where is evil located? And ladies and gentlemen, if that is true, can you really deal with the humanistic agenda without first recognizing what the problem is with humanity? And so I phrase my question to the first answer this way. Can you talk of evil without assuming a moral framework? And can you talk of educating society without first looking inside the human heart? Can you talk of evil without assuming a moral framework? And can you talk of educating a society without first looking inside the human heart? Have you looked into your own heart lately? And as I travel and as I see and as I read, I know how easy it is for you and I to fall victims to the same thing. No, we may not go the route of a man somewhere in Phuket who wants to spend $10,000 changing his body so he can market himself, but we too have a price tag and sell our convictions for other reasons. Until you've seen your own heart, you will never be able to, with the humanist, talk about evil and let it just hang there in isolation. You have to anchor it in some way. So my first question is this: can you talk of evil without assuming a moral framework? Can you talk of educating humanity without first looking inside the human heart? The second is this. First is the reality and mystery of evil. The second is the quest for human justice. How we long and long and long for human justice. Years ago, a book was written called The Insanity Plea, and one of the cases given was that of Hinckley in his attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan. And the man writing the book said, we are going to be faced, and we are now, he said, faced with a strange situation. He said the man prosecuting him, saying he was guilty and should be incarcerated, the man defending him said he was actually insane and ought to be